Viktor Frankl understood loneliness. He had lived it at the most extreme level a human being can experience, the loneliness of a prisoner stripped of every connection to a social world that had given him meaning, surrounded by thousands of other human beings, each equally isolated, each reduced to a number, each cut off from the relationships and communities that had constituted their lives before. In the concentration camps, Frankl observed something that should be impossible, that the presence of many other people can coexist with the most radical loneliness. The camps were crowded. They were never solitary. And yet the system of dehumanization that organized them produced, in most prisoners, an isolation more complete than any physically solitary confinement could have produced. Because the isolation was not spatial but existential, a disconnection from the shared world of meaning that makes genuine human contact possible. This observation was foundational for everything Frankl subsequently wrote about community and belonging. The insight it produced was counterintuitive but, once grasped, impossible to unsee. Human beings need community, but community is not simply the presence of other people. It is a shared relation to something beyond the mere biological fact of co-presence. And when that shared relation to meaning is absent, when people are together but not in any genuine sense oriented toward the same values, the same commitments, the same understanding of what their being together is for, the result is not community. It is a crowd. And crowds, as Frankl observed in both the camps and in the mass phenomena of modern societies, can be the loneliest places on earth. Frankl's thinking about community began well before the camps, in his engagement with the philosophical and political questions of interwar Vienna. He had grown up in a city that was a laboratory of competing ideas about the relationship between the individual and the collective. Marxism offered one answer: the individual is essentially a function of social conditions, and authentic existence requires identifying with the collective movement of history. Nationalism offered another: the individual finds meaning by surrendering to the larger organism of the nation, the race, the Volk. Psychoanalysis, in its clinical application, tended to locate the fundamental human drama in the relation between the individual psyche and its drives, a perspective in which social connection appeared primarily as either a site of conflict or a mechanism of drive sublimation. None of these answers satisfied Frankl, and he was articulating his dissatisfaction in his early clinical work long before history gave him the most brutal possible opportunity to test his alternative. Frankl's alternative began with a philosophical insistence on the irreducibility of the individual person. Drawing on Max Scheler and the phenomenological tradition, he argued that the human person is not a social construction, not simply a product of cultural and historical forces that could in principle be replaced by a different person if the conditions were different. Each person is singular, a specific, unrepeatable combination of capacities, experiences, and orientations toward the world that has never existed before and will never exist again. This singularity is not merely a biographical accident. It carries normative weight. The fact that this particular person exists, that there is a specific I here, with this history and these capacities and these commitments, constitutes a unique demand on existence. Only this person can fulfill what only they are capable of fulfilling. The disappearance of this person would be, in a precise sense, an irreplaceable loss. This insistence on individual irreducibility was, for Frankl, not in tension with the importance of community, but it was in profound tension with certain pathological forms of community. He was particularly concerned with two forms that he saw as mirror images of each other: conformism and totalitarianism. Conformism is the surrender of individual meaning in favor of collective norms, the tendency to define oneself entirely by what others think, by what the group expects, by the standards of the majority. Totalitarianism is the systematic enforcement of this surrender by an external power, the state or movement that demands that individuals cease to be individuals and become merely functions of the collective will. Both, in Frankl's view, represent pathologies of the relationship between individual and community, because both destroy the very thing that makes genuine community possible, the presence of genuine individuals who bring their own meaning, their own responsibility, their own irreplaceable perspective to the shared space. Frankl was clear that conformism is not simply a political problem. It is a psychological one, a response to the anxiety of individual freedom. One of the most consistent findings of his clinical work was that many patients who presented with symptoms of depression or anxiety were, at a deeper level, suffering from what he called existential frustration, the inability to find meaning adequate to their own lives. And one of the most common causes of this inability was the habit, cultural, psychological, familial, of looking to others for permission to exist as oneself. People who have been trained, through childhood or through cultural absorption, to subordinate their own values and perceptions to the expectations of others find themselves in an impossible bind. They cannot access their own meaning because they have learned to distrust their own inner life as a source of meaning. And so they look to the collective, to the group, the trend, the authority, for something they can only find by going inward. Frankl described this dynamic as one of the central features of what he called the existential vacuum, the widespread sense of inner emptiness that he saw as a defining feature of modern Western societies. The existential vacuum does not arise simply from the absence of tradition or religion, though the erosion of these frameworks contributes to it. It arises more fundamentally from the substitution of collective belonging for individual meaning, from the attempt to fill the inner emptiness by crowding it with other people, with group membership, with identification with movements and causes and lifestyle tribes. These substitutions are not entirely without value. Genuine social connection is a real human need. But they cannot substitute for the harder work of discovering and committing to one's own specific meaning, because they address the social dimension of human existence while leaving the existential dimension, the question of what one's own life is for, entirely untouched. The camps, paradoxically, threw this dynamic into sharp relief. Frankl observed that the prisoners who maintained their psychological integrity most effectively were not, in general, the ones who had subordinated themselves most completely to the group. They were the ones who had maintained, even in the camps, some inner life that was irreducibly their own, some commitment, some love, some project, some responsibility that was specifically theirs and that no collective membership could either provide or replace. These individuals could also be genuine members of communities within the camp, could care for others, share resources, maintain solidarity, but they did so from a position of inner stability rather than from a need to dissolve the self into the collective. They gave to the community because they had something to give, not because they were hoping the community would tell them who they were. Conversely, Frankl observed that some of the most psychologically fragile prisoners were those who had built their pre-camp identity entirely around social role and community membership, who had been, in some fundamental sense, constituted by external recognition rather than by inner meaning. When the external recognition was stripped away, they had nothing to stand on. And they sometimes sought, desperately, to reconstruct some form of group identity within the camp, to belong to something, to be somebody in relation to some collective, in ways that were not always healthy. The prisoner elites, the capos and block leaders, prisoners who were given a degree of power over their fellow prisoners by the camp administration, were a particularly painful example of this dynamic. Many of them became, in their exercise of petty power, as cruel as or crueler than their captors. Frankl interpreted this not as evidence of innate human viciousness but as evidence of what happens when a person who has no inner foundation is given a social role. They pour themselves into it entirely, because the role is the only source of identity they have. From these observations, Frankl developed a specific and demanding vision of what genuine community requires. Genuine community, community that is not merely a crowd, not merely a shared escape from individual responsibility, not merely a collective vehicle for satisfying drives, requires individuals. It requires people who have each done the difficult inner work of finding their own specific meaning, their own specific responsibility, their own specific reason for being here. Only such people can genuinely give to a community rather than taking from it the identity they are unable to generate from within. And only such people can be genuinely known by the others in their community, because a person who has not found their own meaning cannot be known, in any deep sense, by anyone else. They can be seen, catalogued, socially placed, but not known, because what is most essential in them has not yet been discovered even by themselves. Frankl saw the deepest form of community as the relationship between two people who have each genuinely encountered themselves, and who therefore have something real to offer each other. He discussed this most extensively in the context of love, which he understood not primarily as an emotion or an attraction but as a mode of perception. To love another person, in Frankl's sense, is to perceive the specific, unrepeatable value of that person's unique existence. It is to see not only who they are now but who they are capable of becoming, the full range of their specific potentials, not as an abstraction but as a concrete vision of this particular individual. This perception is only possible to someone who has, themselves, engaged seriously with the question of their own specific value and potential, who knows what it is like to be perceived as an irreplaceable individual rather than as a function of a role. This has implications that extend far beyond the intimate relation of romantic love. It applies to friendship, to professional community, to civic and political belonging. In each of these domains, Frankl was insisting on the same fundamental principle, that genuine relationship, genuine community, requires that each party be genuinely present as themselves. The colleague who has found meaning in their work and brings that meaning to their professional relationships creates a different kind of community than the one who is merely going through the motions. The friend who has confronted their own existential situation honestly and knows what they actually value can be a different kind of friend than the one who relates primarily through shared distraction from the question of what life is for. The citizen who has a genuine sense of responsibility toward the community, rooted in personal values that they have actually worked out, rather than in conformity to what the group expects, participates differently in public life. Frankl was not naive about the difficulty of achieving this kind of community. He was fully aware that social pressures toward conformity are powerful, that the work of finding one's own meaning is difficult, and that genuine human contact between two people who are each genuinely present as themselves, is rarer than its appearance. But he was insistent that the difficulty does not diminish the importance, and that the most practical contribution anyone can make to the quality of community they inhabit is the contribution of their own genuine presence, their own actual self, found through the hard work of existential honesty, brought to the shared space with the openness and courage that genuine encounter requires. In this, as in so much of his work, Frankl was demanding the harder thing. Not the comfort of belonging as a substitute for meaning, but the achievement of meaning that makes genuine belonging possible. Not the warmth of the crowd as an escape from individual responsibility, but the warmth of genuine human contact, which is available only to those who have been willing to stand in their own individual existence long enough, honestly enough, courageously enough, to have something real to offer when they step into the shared space of community. This is the paradox at the heart of Frankl's vision of community. You can only truly belong when you have first truly been yourself.